Thank you, Daniel, very much. It's just a tremendous pleasure to be here on this beautiful day in Modena. It's a fantastic venue. It's very good. Could I have the sound modified down? Because I'm hearing my... Excuse me, just... Okay. All right, we'll do it this way. Okay. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. La fortuna, luck. Evolution, the history of life is a dance between random chance events and sort of law-like responses, deterministic responses to these chance events. So it's a dance that goes on at all levels, from molecules all the way up through species and ecosystems. And my job for today, my point today, is to try to explore all of these levels and try to paint a picture of the nature of this dance. So in my language of English, fortuna means luck, randomness, chance, as Danielle said, and contingency. Now, there are subtle differences between all of these, but more or less, for today's purposes, that's what I mean. And as opposed to fortuna, we have determinism, and by that I mean law-like responses to a set of conditions. So if A, then B, more or less. Because in complex systems, biological systems, physical systems, things are very complex. And it's very seldom if A, then B. It's always statistical and more or less. But this is what I mean by necessity as well. The French molecular biologist Jacques Monod wrote a book called, it was translated into English as Chance and Necessity. And these are the two terms that I like the best. But I want to make it clear at the outset that Monod, in his book, he said that human beings evolved strictly by chance and not through necessity. Because to Monod, what he meant was necessity, by necessity, was the belief that God created human beings. I'm not talking about that today. I'm talking about chance and necessity strictly within science. Non-miraculous explanations of the origin of new species, the deaths of species, and so forth. Okay. The classic, and I should go on, the classic is this. The classic demonstration or thinking in evolution of the relationship between chance and necessity. On the chance side is the chance changes in genetic information. We call them mutations. And they're random with respect to the needs of the organism. There are precise causes of mutations, but they are chance with respect to what the organism requires. So many mutations are harmful, many mutations are even lethal, some are beneficial, many of them make no difference whatsoever. But it's the organisms that are able to thrive the best, survive, and leave more offspring, which is natural selection. That's the deterministic side of what happens. So natural selection selects or culls out the variation that's produced by mutation and other factors in the genetic environment. So there's a dance between randomness and determinism in natural selection. Just a few words on Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is, I think, still the central figure in the history of evolutionary thinking. And he was the first one to articulate the notion of natural selection. And he did this without no knowledge, no modern knowledge of genetics. So he knew that organisms tend to resemble their parents, and he did not know why. He knew that there was variation in the population, and he knew that that variation could be inherited, but he did not know why. And he also knew that there were these spontaneous changes, new varieties would appear genetically, but he did not know why. And then he read Thomas Malthus, who was a sociologist who was concerned with explaining the human population. And Malthus said that human population tends to grow exponentially, and that famine and disease will control human population. And Darwin said, aha, this must apply to all forms of life of sexually reproducing organisms anyway. There's a limit to how many individuals can exist of a species given the nature of the food supply, the dangers of existence, and so forth. And that was when he came up with the notion of natural selection, and he had no idea about the genetics. So it's a population level phenomenon that you do not need to know the details of inheritance to understand. I thought it would be interesting, just briefly, to show you a page. I guess it's not too legible. Of Darwin's notebook in 1839, when he came up with this idea of natural selection. And he says in that middle part, 3 principles will account for all. Grandchildren like grandfathers. In other words, there's resemblance inherited in the families. There's a tendency to small change, by which he meant the mutations. And then the Malthus point. There's great fertility in proportion to supportive parents. Darwin said in his autobiography that he thought, and everybody else who was a natural historian back then, assumed that only enough children were born each year to replace their parents. But it was from Malthus that he learned that there was this geometric increase, logarithmic increase, caused by sexual reproduction in the numbers of organisms. So something must be limiting the population. So, just one last point on natural selection before I move on to other things. Darwin intended natural selection to be the law-like, anti-chance, anti-fortuna, deterministic, scientific explanation of evolutionary change. But he realized it's statistical. On average, those organisms who are best suited to their environment will be the ones who leave more offspring behind, who the offspring will tend to resemble their parents. So it was a statistical law. And I just think as a footnote to science, one of Darwin's original inspirations was a man named John Herschel, who wrote a book in 1830. It's widely considered to be the first important book of modern philosophy of science. And he was very disappointed. Darwin was very, very disappointed to hear, by rumor, he never heard it directly, that John Herschel, when Darwin published Natural Selection in 1859, Herschel apparently said to somebody, natural selection is the law of higgledy-piggledy. So higgledy-piggledy means it's not the law does not take the same form as a law in physics. If A, then B. It's statistical. It's messy. And Darwin was deeply disappointed and saddened that his hero, Herschel, said this about natural selection. But I think this begins the entire dialogue in the philosophy of science about what is science and how does it comported, and it began the tendency to have a physics model for scientific explanation for what constitutes true science. And as I say, the systems that we deal with are far too complex for those simple rules to apply. So, all right, just to summarize so far, even within natural selection, we have mutation, random, contingent things, and we have selection, which is deterministic. But within populations, it's messy. You have selection, but you have random factors like genetic drift also affecting the distribution of genetic information through time. So, consider, if this is so complex, even at the small genetic level, when we begin to think of the births and deaths of entire species, entire groups of organisms, it gets much more complicated than that. And we see this dance, again, between chance and necessity all the time at all of these levels. A little bit more history, because the origin of the scientific study of the history of life, looking for material causes to explain the changes that life has gone through as you go through time, all hinged around looking for an explanation for where we came from and where the organisms that are alive today around us, where did they come from as well? That was the original question. And people were looking for non-miraculous, non-religious, scientific explanations for that. And do I have... no, I don't. Sorry. No. Oh, sorry. I have another image here. The Frenchman, Georges Cuvier, very important man, he did not believe in evolution. But he did say that the greatest mystery, if you look at the fossil record of the history of life, is that as you get into the younger rocks, you get species become more and more similar to the species that we have today. And eventually, at the youngest rocks, the fossils some of them are the same species that we have today. And he said that was a very great mystery. So that was the problem that they were trying to solve. The two figures that are the most important in this first 2 decades of the 19th century. One was a Frenchman, and the other one was an Italian. They both had the same first name. In English, it's John the Baptist. John Baptiste de Lamarck is a Frenchman. He's very well known. And another person who I think deserves equal standing in understanding the early history of evolutionary thinking scientifically is Jean-Baptiste Le Brocq. And they both worked on fossil mollusks, clams and snails and so forth, and they came up with very different explanations for the history of life. Lamarck thought, let me see now, there we are, there's Lamarck. Lamarck said that if we had all of the information, all of the data, and everything were complete, we would see that species very slowly change into one another. And he said that although most species are extinct now, that most of the species that you see in the fossil record are extinct. There are nonetheless, some of them are there, but the rest of them very slowly changed into the modern fauna. And it was a speculation. Many people did not see the evidence for it, but he was the first serious, I think, evolutionist. This other man, Giambattista Brocchi, the Italian guy, had similar information. But he thought that species, like individual organisms, people, have births and deaths that could be explained. Just like for people, no matter how much God has something to do with knowing about your birth and your eventual death, nonetheless there are natural causes for the births and deaths of individuals. And Brocchi thought the same thing was true of species. And this is famous as Brocchi's analogy. And Brocchi also thought fortuna, bad luck, can cause the extinction of species. But otherwise, species are like people. They have a longevity that's built into their systems. And that was basically the determinism. So there's chance and necessity in Brocchi's view as well. Brocchi thought that, I don't have this, it's a pity, the other pictures did not come. So I wish I could show you. There's a picture of Brocchi's fossils and the living. Brocchi thought that roughly 50% of the fossil species from Tuscany that he had in his collections belonged to species that are still alive. And so, as I say, he was looking for an explanation for this in natural terms. And do I have, I don't know. There's a, let me move on to Charles Darwin. Darwin went on the Beagle, the ship the Beagle. It ran around the world in 5 years, 1831 to 1836. Darwin, it's just becoming clear now that Darwin was comparing the ideas of Lamarck and the ideas of Brocchi as he looked at the fossils and also the living fauna of South America. He found some examples that are similar to what Lamarck was claiming. But mostly what Darwin was finding was very Brocchian type of pattern. For example, in this slide, right here, there's a fossil rodent. It's called a mara. It's a cavy. It's the third largest species, the living one, is the third largest species of rodent in the world. And what Darwin thought he had in the rocks in Bahia Blanca in Argentina with these fossils was a species very closely related to the living species that's here on the right-hand side. But it was smaller. It was different. And Darwin began to see that in the very young rocks, you would have fossils of species that are very similar to those that are alive today, but they're a little different. So one replaces the other. And here we have, yes, Darwin knew about Brocchi's work. This is, let's go to this one. I've been working with my colleague Stefano Dominici from Firenze, and we are able to prove that Brocchi's work was not known just in Italy. It was known all over Europe, and it was particularly important. Interrupted by church bells. This is fortuna. That's deterministic too. It's good. We've been having a great deal of pleasure tracing the impact of Brocchi's ideas in England, in Great Britain, but also in other parts of Europe as well. And Brocchi was a well-known intellectual, and his ideas were quite well understood. And I don't want to spend much more time now, because we're halfway through, I guess, on history. But let me just move to this point. This proves, really, that the young Darwin, his first ideas on evolution, were directly influenced by these ideas of Brocchi's analogy. I will read this, but it's also in Italian up on the screen. It's a letter that Darwin wrote to Leonard Jenyns in 1844. I'll read it. Brocchi's name is not mentioned in here, but his ideas are very clearly here. He says, with respect to my far distant work on species, I must have expressed myself with singular inaccuracy if I led you to suppose that I meant to say that my conclusions were inevitable. They have become so after years of weighing puzzles to myself alone, but in my wildest dream, I never expected more than to be able to show that there are two sides to the question of the immutability of species. It's charming, and it's very funny. It's a call to the faithful. And it says whether species are directly created by God or by intermediate laws, natural laws, as with the life and death of individuals. Brocchi's analogy, I won't read any more of it than that. Brocchi was the only person who was saying these things, and we know that Darwin knew Brocchi. But what happened was, Darwin began in the late 1830s. He came home, he discovered natural selection, and he started thinking about the power of natural selection to modify species through time. So he stopped thinking that Brocchi was right, that species are very stable, discrete entities with separate births and deaths, and started thinking of species as just coming through slow, steady, gradual evolution through natural selection. Ironically, it's almost going in the direction of what Lamarck was saying. So once the species are split, you can follow them up. I'm not doing that. So up through time, slowly transforming from one species into another. That was what Darwin's view was by the time he published The Origin of Species in 1859. So as I say, he started to, no, okay. I think I have some extra slides here, that's all. But ironically, is this where we are? Yeah, he came basically, as I say, to echo the thoughts of Lamarck, that as you go through time, species will just generally flow one into another. And that's, I think, one of the greatest ironies in the history of evolutionary biology, because Lamarck and Darwin are usually contrasted. They had such different ideas about how evolution occurred. But nonetheless, the picture that they painted of what evolution looks like in time was more or less the same by the time Darwin became mature and finally published his ideas. All right. So this is the picture that I was taught. And now I'm going to skip to the 1930s, 1940s. Not quite modern times, but they're getting there. The whole dialogue about understanding what happens when a new species is born was more or less forgotten about ever since Darwin in 1859 until the work of Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is a Russian-born geneticist. He came to New York. He went to Columbia University to study the modern theory of genetics and the laboratory techniques of genetics. He's most famous for going into the nature and seeing if what you learn about genetics in the laboratory can be seen in nature itself. He was a very, very deep thinker. And along with this man, Ernst Mayr, also a European, is born in Germany, but basically came to New York as a young man, worked at the American Museum of Natural History. Together, they came up with an idea of how new species are born, which is still the idea that we're using today, which you could find little bits of in the earlier works like Young Darwin or even in Brocchi. And it's called geographic or allopatric speciation. And let me just quickly, this is not the most recent speech. What happens in the birth of a species, in the conventional thinking, but that's something that I still accept myself, is you have a species that is spread out over a wide area. It begins to differentiate genetically because different environments in different parts of the range, natural selection tracks that, so the adaptations and also the mutations are different in different places. If there is isolation, physical isolation between parts of this species, it could happen that they become reproductively isolated, so that if they meet again, they will be two species instead of one. That's my brief summary. I had a diagram, but I can't show it to you, but it's okay. That's the basic idea that we still use about how new species are born from old ones. It involves natural selection, but it's not done entirely through natural selection. Fortuna is involved because things become accidentally isolated, and then they change for a little bit independently, and then they cannot interbreed again. Okay. But these men, Dobzhansky and Mayr, still left us with a picture of gradual change. Once a new species are born, then there is a divergence, and it's still slow, steady, and gradual. And this brings up where myself and Stephen Jay Gould come into the picture. We changed in 1970s. We changed the picture on the left of the gradual transformation of species through time from species A to B and C, very gradually and slowly, to a picture more like the one on the right, where new species arise from old ones relatively quickly, and species themselves remain stable. They don't change very much. We call that stasis. And so this is the fundamental notion of punctuated equilibria that, as Danielle said, we developed in the early 1970s from the picture on the left, the old picture left over from Darwin, to the picture more on the right, punctuated equilibria. The equilibria refers to long periods of time, millions of years, where there's very little change going on within species. And the punctuation is the relatively brief period where, through natural selection, new species arise from old ones. So there's Steve and me. I'm the guy on the left, and Steve didn't have a beard. So the most important empirical observation was the one that Brocchi himself made, but we didn't have no knowledge of Brocchi, that species remain stable. We grew up believing that evolution is inevitable. It must occur slowly through time. It just willy-nilly. It has to happen. And we, much to our surprise, discovered that species hardly change very much as you go through time. And we, as I say, we call that stasis. And as Steve said, do I have it? Yeah. Since it was so apparently contrary to what Darwin predicted that we would find, as Steve said, it became paleontology's embarrassment. It was a trade secret. So paleontologists stopped talking about the stability. And as Steve also said, stasis is data. It's real. It's empirical, and we should deal with it and recognize it as a real thing. And what this really means, is that most anatomical change, most evolutionary change happens simultaneously with the birth of new species, new lineages, new species. And now, so that's another prediction that you make if you look at other data sets. And I'm very happy to say now that even in molecular biology, the data are beginning to show that this is largely correct. The most important lasting genetic change occurs when species branch off one from another, and not through the history of a species. Okay. This is a technical diagram. These organisms here are called brachiopods. They lived maybe 380, 370 million years ago. They're in the Devonian period. It's just an examination to show that in case after case, you see that if you go through, this is 5 million years of time, there's variation, but there's no real directional change. It's stability. So it's a very general empirical phenomenon. And I think we should ask a little bit. I can speak for hours about what causes stasis, but I don't have an hour. But again, it's chance and necessity. The bird species that are living in Italy, for example, for the most part also occur all the way over to England and all the way over to Japan. The various tits, all the very common species of birds. That's a huge distribution. And the birds look pretty much the same throughout the range, but they show some variation. But they're living in conditions that are a little bit different. It's hotter in Italy than it is in Sweden, for example. There's different rainfall amounts, even within Italy. No rain today, which is great. And so the conditions from place to place are different. The random mutations are different. The predators are different. The diseases are different. The food types are different. So the conditions of existence for any one species is different from place to place, a little bit, and yet it's the same species. So you get a little bit of evolution going on in each local place to match the species better, the local population of the species, to its environment. So again, it's chance and necessity. You add it all up from Japan to England and go down to into Italy and look at these birds, and you look at the birds through time, there's not much change. It's just variation, but there's no way that change is going to occur in any great detail. Anyway, I could talk for hours about that, but I'm not going to. Let me just say about punctuated equilibria before I get on to the last topic of my lecture, that it is a sort of a de facto return to Brocchi. But nobody knew. I didn't know about Brocchi. I'm having so much fun right now discovering what this man said with Stefano Dominici and I. It's so much fun to see. And we're now publishing. Stefano has translated Brocchi, and we are publishing. He's publishing a paper on this for the first time in English. So we're hoping that this man's reputation will spread now because of this. But I want to conclude with a brief examination. I hope I can be brief. It's a huge topic about extinctions and their effects on our understanding of the history of life and understanding of the dynamics of how that history has occurred. Now, this picture it's Gould and me, the usual suspects. But with our mentor, who is 90 years old in this picture, it's his birthday party. His name was Norman D. Newell, And he used to drive us crazy as students because he was the only person who was a paleontologist in the 20th century, mid-20th century, later 20th century, who was interested in the phenomenon of extinctions, particularly mass extinctions on a global scale. And Gould and I as students used to think, and our fellow students, that he was talking too much about extinction and not enough about evolution. And now we know that you don't get much evolution without extinction, and the two things interplay like this. It's a constant dance. Life remains pretty much the same unless you disturb life up to and including some of these major mass extinction events that have happened. So yeah, that's what I just said. So this is what the history of life really looks like. It's just a sample from a technical paper about trilobite evolution, trilobite history. But you see species, those black bars, they persist for a certain amount of time, a couple of million years, whatever. And then some of them persist, but lots of them then become extinct. And they are replaced by other species that evolve right after them. And that is the last 500 million years of life. Looks more like that than the picture that Darwin left us with a gradual change through time. So, let me just mention, there's three levels. At the smallest level, ecosystems, local populations. Disasters are happening all the time. A volcano or a forest fire. Nowadays, sadly, oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, so forth. Destroy local populations, kill everything. But life moves on, and there's not too much evolution going on, because what happens is once the environment recovers, the same species that are still alive, that were in populations that were unaffected by the local disaster, they come in and they reestablish communities. And life goes on. A little bit of change, a little bit of luck involved, no evolution really to talk about. At the intermediate level, which is what I just showed with this, I guess, this slide. Yeah. I think that's where most of the action in the history of life occurs. It's when the environmental change happens, like global cooling events, or now global warming events, things like that, are sufficiently widespread and severe that entire species become extinct. That is very critical, because then you see the corresponding evolution of new species virtually right away, and new ecosystems are built, but they don't have exactly the same players. They have some of the older players, some of the older species, but then you get new ones coming in as well. So I think that's really where most of the sort of the important events in the history of life, basic history of life, have happened. But it's easier to see this on the global disasters, the global mass extinctions, of which we have had 5 or 6 that have happened naturally. But of course, this biodiversity crisis, which I could also talk on for several hours, is happening right now. And for the first time, it's the agent of change is human beings. And it's an accident. It's purely an accident because we are just being ourselves. We're building cities, we're coming, we're giving lectures, we're sitting, we get together, and it's just, we're living our lives. But we are so successful that our population has expanded. We don't live in local ecosystems anymore. We have a different way of organizing, so we're not limited by natural resources so much anymore. So the population has exploded. I think there was maybe 2.5 billion people when I was born in 1943. And now we have 6 billion, we have at least twice as many people, almost 7 billion people on the earth. So by accident of our existence, we are destroying the environment, we're over-harvesting the resources out there, we're polluting as a side effect of our way of life, and we're driving at least 30,000 species extinct every year. It's a side effect. It's bad fortuna for the rest of life on Earth as we live our lives. Now it's beginning to be bad fortuna for us as well, and we're finally waking up and knowing that we should do something about this. But mass extinctions are real. They have happened in the past quite without us, and now they're happening through our agency, and we have to pay attention to that. The biggest mass extinction of the past, though, is in many ways the most dramatic, because perhaps as many as 96% of all the species, millions of species on Earth, became extinct within a period of maybe 1 or 2 million years. We're still not even sure what caused it. It was 245 million years ago. But if you can think of that, the implications of that are incredible. It means that of all of the living species on Earth right now, 50 million species that we have right now, certainly including ourselves, all came out of the surviving 4% of the genetic information that survived that big mass extinction event 245 million years ago. To me, that's Steve Gould's contingency. It's just, there's an awful lot of luck around about who survives, and then it becomes deterministic again. New species that are highly adapted evolve. There's the law-like response comes in, but the genetic information that it's based on is a highly skewed and random almost selection of what was there in the past. A few more minutes? Okay. I think it's even easier and more dramatic for us to look at this. Slightly less severe mass extinction, but it's the most famous one. It happened 65 million years ago. We lost the big dinosaurs. Now it turns out birds themselves are a form of dinosaur, but we lost the big terrestrial dinosaurs. We lost many kinds of organisms that lived in the oceans as well. So it was a genuine mass extinction. And in this instance, we're pretty sure we know what happened, that one or more bolides or extraterrestrial objects, comets or meteors, struck the Earth and created basically a holocaust of fires, darkness, cutting out the sunlight coming through for many years, so destroying the base of the food chain by preventing photosynthesis in large measure. So the Earth, for a little while, was a terrible, desolate place, and we lost the dinosaurs. And that's very dramatic. And then the mammals had always been there ever since there were dinosaurs for 150 million years. But the dinosaurs remained ecologically simple and did not diversify. They were more or less like rats in the Mesozoic or something like that. And meanwhile, you had these big dinosaurs, little dinosaurs, meat eaters, plant eaters, and so forth. So it was the reptiles that were ruling the ecosystems. And after the dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years ago, there was a delay. There's always a delay. The bigger the extinction, the longer the wait. 6, 7, 8 million years. And then the mammals began to evolutionarily diversify. So here's a primitive mammal. Itself became extinct as well. So then the mammals radiated into all the different kinds of mammals that we know today, including flying mammals, bats, marine mammals like whales and porpoises and so on and so forth. The entire gamut of mammalian diversity did not appear until after the dinosaurs and the other creatures became extinct. So again, it's highly contingent. Yeah, and that's what I'm just saying. This also includes ourselves. We appear in the fossil record, our species, I think maybe 120, 130,000 years ago for sure, and the genetic analysis seems to indicate that we might be slightly older than that. But the genetic information and the fossil record pretty much agree. So the old boys, like particularly Brocchi, but also Lamarck, this is what they were looking for. They also wanted to see the early evidence of the natural origins of our own species. And now we have this evidence. But you can understand that the evolution of humans is a mixture of determinism, of adaptation, and also luck, chance and necessity. If the dinosaurs had not gone extinct, the mammals would not have diversified, and human beings would never have appeared on Earth. So that was luck. Luck for us, bad luck for the dinosaurs. But then, of course, natural selection is an anti-chance principle, and there are many adaptations in the mammalian world. We are very primitive mammals ourselves, but we have some specializations. We walk upright, and of course we have brains. And eventually our culture, which really frees us up and makes us quite a unique organism. We are the result of the evolutionary process, but we are not inevitable. We're not inevitable. Monod said, it's not necessity, but he meant God. It's not necessity even scientifically that we would automatically appear. There was a lot of chance involved, but there was necessity as well in the sense of causation, of adaptation. And you have to understand this dance, and it's very complex, just to understand who we are and where we came from. So, un momentito, what is this? Let me just go to the end. And, yeah, this just says, just to summarize, this dance between chance and necessity goes on at the genetic level, and it goes on at the level of ecosystems, species, and indeed entire groups of animals. Dinosaurs are a large group of species, all related, all descended from the same common ancestor. So evolution is not the simple process of if A, then B, that sometimes it's presented as. Sometimes in the genetics lab it sort of looks like that. But there's so much contingency in the history of life that to understand the evolutionary process fully, you have to understand this dance, this interplay between chance and necessity. So I call it there's a story in Modena here about the stolen bucket. I have a 10 years ago, I named this picture of evolution as the sloshing bucket, because what happens on the ecological side, random, lots of it is random physical changes in the earth that life has no way to anticipate, has an effect on the genetic side, on the evolutionary side. And it happens at many levels. That natural selection is just organisms within populations, but also local disturbances, intermediate disturbances, and then the major global mass extinctions. So my sense of the sloshing bucket is that things start on the left-hand side, there's environmental change, and it depends on how severe it is, how global it is, what the effect will be on the genetic side. And sometimes it affects entire groups and drives groups extinct, but then you see the replacement of those groups by the evolution of new ones. So it's a cause and effect. It bounces back from both sides of the diagram. Once again, it's enormously complex, but it can be understood if we tease it apart and think about it as hard as we can. So with that, I will end, and thank you very much for your attention.